I'm going to open actually with the words from the book of Daniel, chapter 7, verse 13 to 15. This is what it says. In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Let me pray. Father, thank you for this time together. Thank you that we can meet like this on Zoom. We just pray that this will be an encouragement to many, Lord, in these uncertain times. And we're reminded of the words in Hebrews that Jesus will never change. He will be the same yesterday, today, and forever. And we give you praise for that. In Jesus' name. Amen.
Thanks, John, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to, this is the third of our Order In panel discussions. And yeah, looking at the question, what will change in the world after COVID-19, what won't? Of course, if we've learned anything from this year, it's that nobody is an expert when it comes to predicting the future. But we did think it would be helpful to try and get a group of people together who might be able to give more educated guesses in their particular fields, and also speak from a Christian point of view. So it's a joy and privilege just to introduce the panel briefly, and I'll ask each of them questions about their specific field. I'll just work through the panel one by one, and then we'll discuss things more broadly at the end. As John mentioned, please keep a note of those questions. So we have on the panel tonight Marcus Bader. He will be known to many of us at St. Peter's. Marcus actually relocated to Switzerland literally as lockdown was happening back in March. Marcus moved to Europe to start a role as, I think Marcus is European Director of the missions agency SIM. I think he studied for a degree in public health. He also worked for SIM in the field of epidemiology, working on their HIV/AIDS program, and I think also some of their programs to do with Ebola. Then also, next person I'll speak to on the panel will be Gavin Fish. Gavin, also known to many in the Valley, he's the principal of Fisher High School. He's been in that role for the last 11 years. He has 33 years of experience in education. 20 of those years have been in school leadership and management. He specializes in problem solving and conflict management, although that's not always his own choice. He's also author of the excellent book, Taming the Teenager, and he's spoken to us at St. Peter's before on that book. Adam Spagnaletti also lives in the Valley and currently works on the emerging market investment team at Coronation. Previously worked in London with JP Morgan and Threadneedle. He's qualified as a CA and a CFA. Royden Frost is a minister at Christchurch Midrand, was actually placed at St. Peter's during his time at GWC. So some of you will remember Royden. Married to Joan, they've got 3 kids. Many years ago, he studied economics, I think to master's level. And then he worked briefly for the Department of Trade and Industry and also for the National Treasury before going into full-time ministry. So those are the guys, we'll hear from each of them one by one. I'm going to start with Marcus Bader. Marcus, thanks again for joining us all the way from Switzerland. Maybe just before we get into the details of kind of public health and epidemiology, what's it like in Europe at the moment? I mean, in some ways, you're kind of ahead of us in this sort of COVID cycle. Yeah, how are things going in it? How does it feel to be in a country that is kind of opening up? I think it's opening up. I don't know if they're having a second spike in Switzerland.
Yeah, well, it's good to be with you all. It's good to see everyone again. Yes, we've been open since almost mid-May, and we are now seeing for the last 4 or 5 weeks, an average number of cases between 100 and 200. We had dwindled down to less than 20 per day, and we have a population of 8 million, or just above. So we are kind of leveling at that summer holiday, people bringing it back from holidays kind of infections. But the country is open. Schools are opening, schools starting next week, actually. And yeah, the only signs that you have that there's COVID is, 2-meter markings on the grounds in the stores and hand sanitizers. So we're pretty open. There's mask requirements for public transport, but not otherwise. So we're very much kind of post the emergency situation and more into the management situation of the crisis.
And so people able to go to cinemas, go to church? Is it public gatherings okay?
Yeah, public gathering to 1,000. But even then you have to have quite strict measures and plans you submit to government before you get approval to having it. Churches are back, but they have to maintain certain guidelines that the government stipulates. So some churches are not able to meet as a whole church because of their size. Others have chosen to remain a bit longer with just online services. So it's a mixture of that. But for the most part, activities are back to normal. So companies will have board meetings, team meetings at work, all those things are happening. Some are happening with more distance in between people. But most things are running openly.
Well, I'm sure that with it being Switzerland, I'm sure it's been absolute shambles and chaotic and nobody knowing what they're doing. I'm sure nothing's been run well at all. Marcus, just thinking now as your background in epidemiology, I guess thinking firstly from a global point of view, I might ask you what you think of the South African situation, but what does this world look like over the coming year, specifically in relation to the virus? Does it kind of disappear completely? Are there second spikes? What are your thoughts on how this virus plays out over the next year or so?
Well, I think we're going to see a flattening out and maybe an overall decrease of new cases if we're looking at maybe 4 or 5 months from now. I think most countries that are currently experiencing massive spikes, like South Africa, Brazil, some of the other countries that are seeing large numbers still, that will flatten out eventually to a certain level. I think each country will have different levels at different times. It'll become a virus that is present among us, like the flu, like in some African countries, malaria or yellow fever or some of the other ones. And I think it'll be part of life. Governments will figure out how to manage. They'll give advice to people on where to travel, where not to travel. There'll be hotspots that appear and disappear. It's happening in Europe. Geneva in Switzerland was just put on the blacklist for people from Belgium. So Belgium said don't travel to Geneva. So I think as there's little hotspots that flare up, different governments will give different advice. But I think overall we will see it become something normal as part of everyday life. Some people will get sick. Some people will still die, even with a vaccine and even with maybe what is hoped for to be herd immunity. The virus won't just disappear. So I think it'll be part of normal life in the future. When exactly that happens and when exactly all countries are comfortable with it, that's a whole other question. But I think that's kind of what we're headed towards.
But you're saying that, even in say 5 years' time, we will still be, COVID-19 will still be in our conversations. We'll hear of people who have died from this virus. There will still be evidence of precautions all over the place for it.
Yes, I'm sure, because it is much more infectious than, let's say, the common flu. So it's transmitted quite easily. So it will be around. We will hear about it. Maybe we'll develop something like the flu shot you can get. But because it's a virus that can change easily, I think there'll be different strains of it, just like the flu. So we will see needing to get new flu shots every year or every 2 years or however. So I think we will hear of deaths still as well. But I think our healthcare systems will be better prepared to treat. We will have more options in medicines that help diminish the severity of symptoms. So I suspect that death rates will go down as well. But it'll take some time for everyone to figure out what that actually means. But I think that's what we're headed towards.
And so winters in the foreseeable future, winter, like with the normal cold, winters will be the sort of the danger time.
I think the verdict is still out on that. I'm not sure if cold versus warm makes a big difference. So I think there's not enough data yet to say this acts like the flu. It's most active when it's colder. I think there's not enough data to really say that this is just a seasonal thing at this point. Who knows, over time we might know more, but we need to get at least through 1 or 2 full seasons. So 2 full years to even be able to tell, is there a correlation between temperatures, climate, and the frequency of infection?
And Marcus, is the South African scenario any different to that? I mean, our death rates have been low, which is a positive sign, but then our healthcare system isn't first world, which is a worry. Well, any thoughts on the scenario for South Africa over the coming years?
Well, I think one of the bigger concerns for South Africa is most likely the economic impact. I think in a country that is strapped for resources as it is, that would be probably the biggest concern. But in terms of the disease itself, I believe the early and strict lockdown did really slow down and give the healthcare system time to develop a response. Whether that's Constantiaberg getting ready to become a COVID, receiving place, or others, repurposing parts of their hospitals. I think it gave enough time to do that. That's what Italy did not have. And that's why Italy had such a high death rate. So I think in that sense, South Africa's done really well. Now, interestingly enough, I just read an article about some of the really poor areas in Mumbai, India. And they found that 60% of the people in the slums in Mumbai test positive for COVID-19. So they almost are at a point of herd immunity, and nobody knew that they even had massive outbreaks in what would be equivalent to our townships in South Africa. So and people died, but it was mostly younger population in those areas anyway, so not that many died. And it was hard to decide, did they die of, cholera? Did they die of other diseases related to, or was it really just COVID-19? So I think South Africa is doing quite well, in my opinion. I think the difficulty will be dealing with the economic fallout. And how do you deal with future outbreaks, whether those are localized outbreaks or nationwide outbreaks? I think that'll be the big challenge for the government and for health officials to manage. I think you're seeing a decline now. From what I can tell from the data, I think the peak may have been reached of this first wave. I think Western province maybe reached it a bit sooner than the country as a whole. So that bodes well for the measures that are in place. But yeah, so we'll see where it ends up. But the study from India really is a bit more optimistic about herd immunity and about death rates in general. And I think hopefully that will hold true for South Africa as well.
But in short, it's kind of this is with us now for the long term. But life will open up. It'll just be part of normal life will now be sudden intervention by government, sudden shutdowns in certain places, certain measures remaining in place. But life will open up. We'll just have to realize that this COVID-19 is just a part of our lives.
Yeah. So it's a kind of, it doesn't make sense to talk about a post-COVID world, really. It makes sense to talk about life plus COVID-19 because it's going to be around. So it's not really a post-COVID thought. It's much more of a life with COVID-19.
Thanks for the good news. Marcus, we'll come back to you in a bit. Let me move on to Gavin Fish. Thanks so much for joining us, Gavin.
Hey, Murray. Nice to be with you.
Now, Gavin, when it comes to the field of education, I'm sure like so many other areas and industries, you're living one week to the next. Have you been able to kind of look to the future and try and predict what education might look like in the future?
Murray, the short answer is no, we haven't, and we don't know what the future looks like. It seems that as soon as I send a letter to the parent community telling them what it was 2 hours, I get a notification from National that it is no longer the case, and I have to retract it. My classroom years as a history teacher, and the only thing that man has ever learned from the past is that man has part. So throughout the tragedies of COVID, we need to remember that it was not called World War I, it was called the war to end all wars, until it didn't, until World War II happened, and that pattern is throughout history. So the nature of man will remain the same, and as much as I want the world to be a gentler and a kinder place, and as much as I want to believe that the world will be more relationship based, I'm not going to hold my breath too long on that. The good news is that parenting will be needed more than ever before. Quality parenting, boundaries based, value based, and that educators will be no less needed, despite the fact that distance learning has been the main word at the moment. Let me leave it there for now.
And Gavin, just, I mean, the question that I think is on all of our minds as parents is sort of, we all have this kind of suspicion that what our kids are going through is going to leave gaps in their education somehow. Is that just parents being paranoid? I don't feel you've got to sugarcoat this for us, but what is the impact on a child, say, a matric or grade 7 who has this kind of disruption? What is the impact down the line on a child's education?
There has been quite a lot of paranoia, but that's understandable because things are so uncertain. The first that I need to dispel is that there will be large-scale, massive numbers failing the year. That won't happen. A slightly bigger concern is that if you don't master certain mathematical concepts in grade 8, it makes grade 9 that much harder. It varies from subject to subject, the extent to which that is a reality. I'm far less concerned about the academic loss than I am about social emotional factors. Teenagers need to socialize. I think that's one reason that I'm so strongly an advocate of big school education as opposed to homeschool education, because of the value of the socializing, in a nutshell.
And Gavin, just talk us through, what is, many parents at Fisher High will know what it's been like, but for those who don't have kids there, for those who perhaps don't have kids at school at all, what has this been like for you as an educator? I mean, not looking so much to the future now, but just living through the last 5 or 6 months. What's it been like for you?
Okay, there've been a couple of real pluses, and that is introverts have come into their own. We live in a world that is dictated by the extrovert ideal, and introverts suddenly have found that they are succeeding in a world that requires to be self-driven and on your own and social distancing. And I've seen introverts absolutely blossoming. So that is the plus that has come out of this. I've seen other kids that have risen to the challenge of having to drive themselves and to become self-motivated. In the past, they've only ever responded to either the carrot or the stick. So there's been an extent to which teenagers emotionally are maturing at far greater level than they would have in the past. Tragically, technology has not narrowed the divide between the haves and the have-nots. And the fourth industrial revolution is not serving a humanitarian value or urgency. But then at the same time, we've seen incredible ability for technology to bridge the gap, and for children either through WhatsApp or through tablets or through laptops, accessing work and being able to continue with it at a distance. And the distance learning is not the impossibility that we thought it was.
And so, Gavin, if you look to the future, you take into account what Marcus has said, the fact that this is going to be with us. Let me put you on the spot and say, let's say tomorrow you were made Minister of Education for South Africa. What would be the things that you would do? What would be your priorities?
If we were going to face a lockdown scenario again, I would ensure that technological capacity reaches the poorer communities and that they've got access to data unrestricted. I think that's critical if any form of distance learning is going to take place. This is going to add urgency to redeveloping curricula around 21st century needs. The employers are telling me, Gavin, you've got to send me kids that can communicate, that can collaborate, that can be creative, and that have got critical thinking skills. And not enough of our syllabi cover those critical competencies. And whether COVID was to have existed or not, we have to move towards those urgencies.
And Gavin, just finally, I mean, just in terms of how things are going at Fisher High, what can we be praying and doing for you and your team going forward? I'm sure it's been really tough and stressful. What are the main concerns? What can we be praying for you?
The first concern is that parents, for completely understood and acceptable reasons, are either now unemployed or underemployed, and that has impacted our school fee recouping ability. I've had to impose significant salary cuts across the board from between 22 to 50%. And that's obviously only the governing body employed educators. So I'm sitting in a school with everybody working 100%, but half of them being paid their full salary and half of them really suffering for it. I've got educators with young children who have been at one and the same time parenting, managing their own children's online teaching, and at the same time trying to distance learn their own pupils. The stresses have been enormous. School is essentially a college at the moment. Educators come in to teach lessons and then go home. Half the pupils at school at any one given time, the grade 8s and 9s still to come in. Tremendous pressures, Murray. Massive need for prayer. Don't stop praying ever. Thank you.
Gavin, thanks so much. We will come back to you in a bit. Let me just move on to Adam. Adam Spagnaletti. Adam, thanks for joining us. How are you doing tonight?
Yeah, good. Thanks. Thanks for the invitation. Great to be here.
Yeah. Adam, thinking now just from a financial markets point of view, in South Africa, across the world, what do you think? I know no one's got the perfect crystal ball, but what do you think we're in for in terms of financial markets?
So it's quite interesting. I was just looking at some numbers before the start of the meeting, and I mean, what's interesting is how markets have already recovered a lot, and they often talk about this, the kind of, you can have this disconnect between Wall Street and Main Street. So if you look at the US stock market, it fell from 30,000 to 20,000 when kind of the COVID crisis broke. So it came down by a third, and it's now sitting at 27,000. So you can see how it's made up almost all those losses. And I'm sure kind of the man in the street doesn't feel like the situation's recovered like the market's recovered. So I think that's, as a starting point, I think the markets have already moved to kind of price in the scenario that's not as bad as it is initially thought. So I think that's kind of an interesting starting point. And I think what we're seeing, what's interesting kind of theme in the markets is an increasing divide between the winners and the losers. So I think in a kind of more normalized world, kind of different, say, companies or sectors were kind of trading together, whereas now some really interesting themes are emerging. And I think it maybe ties a little bit to what Marcus was sharing about how, you know, we're not necessarily going to go into a post-COVID world. It would just be a different world. So what you're seeing is things like anything that's online related has been very strong. But things like travel have not recovered. So, I mean, the market's interesting. The market's a very clever animal. There's a lot of very smart minds playing the market. And the market kind of prices in the future. So it's not always going to be right. But I think what happens in the stock market can actually give you some very interesting insights into what a lot of very smart people are predicting for the future. And that's we're going to live in a lot more of an online world. So things like online e-commerce companies, those stocks have all been very strong. Gaming companies are doing very well. And as I say, it's more of the kind of old school economy companies that have not, their share prices have not bounced. So I think the market's kind of sending some very interesting signals. One other interesting theme is anything kind of at home. So I'm currently working on a company called Asian Paints, which is the leading paints company in India. And they've just released some results where they had 14% volume growth in the recent quarter. And that's kind of fascinating. So it shows you how some products are actually doing very well in this environment. And I think the fact that people are spending more time at home, they're not traveling as much, they're not eating out as much. Suddenly they've got maybe some extra in their budget they didn't have before, and you're seeing people spending a lot more on their homes. So I think it's all these, for me, they're very interesting signals and themes that are pointing to how the world is going to look very different and how we're going to live very differently kind of following COVID.
And you mentioned this kind of, there's some form of recovery already. Emerging markets like South Africa, will they lag in that recovery?
Yeah, I think probably they will, because you can see I think what's happening, it's favoring the advanced economies. So it's those economies that are really on the front foot, who more online enabled. So it's interesting in emerging markets is how China has been one of the strongest markets. And, that's maybe surprising, given this was kind of where the trouble started, but I think they were better prepared. I mean, China is, their government is a bit of a machine in terms of how they handle things. I think they've dealt with it very well, very ruthlessly, as they tend to do. But they've also got some of the highest online penetration in the world. I mean, their e-commerce is around 30% of total retail, where even in somewhere like the US, that's only around 15%. So China really leads in terms of online. But then unfortunately, somewhere like South Africa has lagged a lot. I mean, the only shares have really been doing well is Naspers, which is obviously the majority of that business is Tencent, which is the leading online, one of the leading online companies in China. Brazil's also been struggling, where I think Marcus was mentioning how they're also struggling with COVID. So it is, I mean, the emerging markets, there's a huge, you can't put them all in one basket. There's some very divergent countries, but again, those themes are very clear to those who kind of the most online enabled are on the front foot.
And so, I mean, I hear different figures given for kind of how long the recovery takes. But I mean, is this, from an economic point of view, do we come out of the woods in a kind of a year's time, 2 years' time in South Africa? Any your prediction there?
Yeah, I think that's the $1 million question that all the economists who are probably smarter than me are trying to figure out. But look, I think the challenge for South Africa is I think we're already we're in quite a weak position when we entered this crisis, and I feel like it's a crisis we couldn't really afford. And most economies are going to be driven by the consumer, and I think the consumer is in a very tough place. I mean, what Gavin was just mentioning about the impact he's seeing on parents at the school. I mean, that's obviously very widespread. So I think it's probably going to take quite a while. I would guess it's, I wouldn't like to put any numbers out there, but I think it's going to take quite a while before we can come out of the woods.
Okay. Adam, thanks.
Cool.
Royden, it's your job to give us some good news.
Does anybody else want to take the good news?
Thanks for joining us, man.
Yeah, thanks. Listen, I see some of my books over your shoulder there. I'd like them back.
Yeah, after lockdown. Roger, you're I know you're working as a pastor of a church now. Your background was in economics and you worked for the Treasury. And I thought maybe you could speak just to the broader macroeconomic stuff. Your thoughts in terms of what the future looks like?
Yeah, so I mean, I think just to affirm what Adam was saying, we were in a technical recession before this crisis hit. So we had 2 quarters of negative growth. Investment levels have been falling since 2015. GDP per capita growth has been falling since 2015. So we've been getting poorer since 2015, effectively. And then we had this. And globally, you've just seen a massive drop in demand. Obviously, people have been locked down. There's also the market psychology where you kind of circle the wagons in a period of crisis. You're more conservative with your spending. And over the longer term, that also affects supply. So businesses close because they can't be sustained. And so that just deepens the contraction. So if I could just share one growth, just to give the picture of what I think the severity of the thing is. So this is from the IMF, and this is their real GDP growth forecast for 2020. Everything in red is a greater than 3% contraction. So you can see that's pretty much most of the world's major economies and a lot of the emerging market, significant emerging market economies. So it's not looking pretty for 2020. Our biggest problem, just to go back to us, I would say in that context, is our debt to GDP ratio. So you compare it to a household, what we've done during the Zuma administration is we bonded ourselves to the hilt. You know, we bought 3 cars, all on finance. We run up our credit card debt, and we've got every card available at every retailer, and we've maxed out that debt as well. So what does that mean for your household finances? It means that everything available you are spending to service your debt. And our debt to GDP ratio is chasing 90%, and before it turns, and it will only turn if there's significant fiscal austerity plus reform-induced growth, which means serious structural change to our economy, things like the labor market, for instance. And the question is then, is there political appetite for that, right? So that means a fight between Tito Mboweni and other forces in the political economy, like the trade unions, for instance. But on the other side, so there's kind of countervailing forces. So on the other side, there's massive, unprecedented levels of liquidity that's been pumped into the system in the developed markets. So debt has never been cheaper. Money's never been cheaper. You've got negative interest rates with the ECB, central banks of Denmark, Japan, Sweden, Switzerland. What that really means is they are penalizing retail banks who want to park their excess cash with the central bank. And that just sends a strong signal to consumers. We don't want you to save. Don't put your money with us, spend it, right? Spend, they're just trying to get the consumption going. I think that's what Adam was also saying. And they're doing everything they can. So you've got 750 billion euro aid package put together by the ECB. Congress are currently haggling over, at the low end, it's a $1 trillion package. At the high end, it's $3 trillion. Now, with all of that liquidity, that tends to make, because the money's so cheap, because the dollar is potentially devaluing, that tends to make gold and precious metals attractive as an asset class, which will obviously benefit us. And all that liquidity in the system also flows through in terms of access to cheaper debt for the South African government, for South African firms at a time when we really need it. Higher gold price is also good for the rand. It drives down inflation, which in turn drives down interest rates. So that's why I say there's kind of countervailing forces, and it then becomes very difficult to know where a small price-taking emerging market ends up, especially when you consider our own internal politics and all of those dynamics. It's interesting though, even with all the stimulus that the ECB has put together and a much stronger economic base to start with, the EU are still expecting an 8 to 12% contraction this year, and a 2 to 3 year recovery period. The US are looking at a 6% contraction. Their unemployment has already risen from 3.7% in 2019 to 10.4% now. And our own treasury is talking about 7.2% contraction for us for this year. 3 to 5 million jobs at risk. So their worst case scenario pushes our official employment rate over 50%. That's their worst case scenario. But their best case scenarios are not pretty either. And the IMF is estimating that our real per capita GDP growth is going to contract by close to 10%. So we're going to be 10% poorer by the end of this year. I think so to kind of come around to the conclusion of all of that, I think we can be pretty sure of significant pain over the next 24 months, and then a slow recovery after that. Over the medium term, it's possible that things improve given the amount of liquidity and the speed of the response by the big developed economies. Sorry, that was a big mouthful, but
that's helpful. That's really helpful. Royden, I know we were on a webinar a few months ago, and one of the positive things that came out of their webinar is that the guys on the panel there were saying that one of the positive signs is that this has forced government and business to communicate more and to work more closely together. I don't know if that's still the case, kind of 2 months on. You used to kind of work in government. What's your perception? Is the relationship getting better through this, or is it starting to sour again?
So it's an interesting one. I still think that our political economy is a massively contested space. And so you see kind of positive signs of that. So for instance, the government standing firm on the public sector wage bill, but then you see concessions on the other side, like the SAA bailout, which doesn't make any economic sense. Also the decision to close the schools, our Minister of Education under massive pressure from SATU, when her own department were advising that she keeps them open. So it's messy, and you just don't know if the political capital is there, if our president has the political capital to force through the decisions that really make sense economically and are in the best interests of or seemingly in the best interests of the wider society. So they are talking, but just how much, how far the president can push the common sense agenda is an open question.
Yeah. Royden, thank you, man. I think we need to move on. I know some people might have questions for each of the panelists, but I wanted to just, we all know it's a really uncertain future. And yet everyone on this panel is a follower of Jesus Christ. And I wanted to, maybe I'll actually start with you. I see you kind of got the mic now. How, as you quote stats like that, you look to the future, as you look at the church that you lead, it is an uncertain future. Times are pretty dark. How's your Christian faith kind of helped you through this time, and as you look to the future?
Yeah, it's been interesting. It's cutting quite close to the bone. My wife is in tourism, and her clients are all US, UK inbound stuff. She hasn't earned a cent of revenue. Her little business hasn't earned that supports 2 families effectively, hasn't earned a cent of revenue since March. So it's not a hypothetical for us, or for many people in our congregation. But I just think the thing that really encourages me is just the Bible's teaching on God's providence. So Amartya Sen is a Nobel laureate. He said he's famous for saying there's never been a famine in a democracy. So none of us, if you're on a Zoom call, in this day and age, it's unlikely that you've ever missed a meal except out of choice. And yet famine was common in Bible times, a catastrophe of that nature where literally the population is starving to death. We see it in the life of Joseph. We see it in the life of Naomi. We see the massive reversal in the life of Job. And through all of that, we see God's hand, not just providing, but working things out according to his purposes. So using those catastrophes for the good of his people and for for the good of his divine purposes. And I think the place where I see it most strikingly is at the cross. So there you have the greatest human evil ever perpetrated, but it's also humanity's greatest triumph under Christ and in Christ. And the Lord has taken something so heinous as crucifying God Almighty, but turned it into our liberation. And so this is the mystery of God's providence, and we don't understand it in the moment. I mean, imagine standing at the foot of that cross and asking yourself, what good is coming from this? But it's our salvation. It's our invitation into glory. And so that's what gives me so much comfort, is just knowing that if I don't understand, it's confusing, it's chaotic, it's scary, but I can trust the Lord. I can trust the Lord that he will do something that brings him glory and that is ultimately for the good of his people, even in the midst of these very dark and distressing times. So that's what gives me comfort.
Amen. Thank you, brother. It's really encouraging. Gavin, could I ask you a similar thing? I mean, it sounds like you must have had some nightmarish conversations and things to deal with, with staff members, and just the sort of change you've had to lead through. How has Jesus kind of helped you through this time?
I've always had a very deep sense of God's calling on my life, and I have no doubt that being principal of Fishhook High School was part of God's calling on my life. And so somebody said to me a while back, Gavin, you've been called for such a time as this. I'm not sure I wanted that, but that is the reality. So I do see it as a sense of calling, but I've found this time incredibly spiritually tough, and my prayer life has suffered significantly. I spent a lot of time in the book of Proverbs, seeking wisdom, seeking God's wisdom. I found being out of church fellowship not good, and I'm now too comfortable with not being at church. I'm praying that lockdown does end quite soon so that I can reestablish fellowship with my home cell. My wife and I have read the Bible and prayed together for 32 years in the morning. That hasn't stopped. But my relationship with God has definitely taken a knock.
Yeah, no, I mean, as you look to the future, we'll be praying for you in that, man. And do you find that are there Christians at Fishhook High who are sort of able to support each other? Is there any kind of aspect of fellowship there, or is it's just not possible at the moment?
You know, the last email I got today was just a photograph sent to me by a colleague with the scripture, "Be still and know that I'm God." And I've had the most incredible sense that the school is upheld in prayer by the broader community. We do share with each other, and we share inspirations and spiritual points of significance to each other. And I think that the Christians have become more authentic. We're inclined to say things that are real and perceptive to each other more so than we have in the past. So I've definitely felt God's support and God carrying me and the school at this time.
Thanks, man. Thank you for that. Adam, let me ask you your experiences. I mean, it's I have other friends in finances and in finance, and yet I speak to them at the end of their day, and they just sound like they make it sound like it's chaos. It must have been a very stressful time for you in that kind of environment. What's helped keep you going spiritually? What's given you hope?
Yeah, I think it has been a very kind of very, very stressful time. As you know, just those earlier numbers I showed the kind of volatility that one's been dealing with, and it's been very hard to make sense. And as an investor, you want to be making kind of well-considered, rational decisions, and that's very difficult when things are so up in the air. But I think spiritually, I mean, for me, I'd say it's been a spiritually intense time. And I think I liked just how Royden was sharing. I mean, my experience has been it's really been a time of shaking loose kind of anything worldly. And I think particularly as someone who works in finance, when you're close to money, it's that's the temptation, which is why I think if God calls you into finance, you hope that he's prepared you well, because it is littered with pitfalls in terms of being close to money. But I think this time for me, it's been really good of just shaking loose the things of the world. And I find myself a lot more focused on thinking about eternity, and just, there's wonderful scriptures about storing up your treasures in heaven, and where your treasure is, your heart will be. And so for me, it's been a time just of spending a lot more time, I think, thinking about my eternal future. And just something I felt God say to me during this time, which is quite radical. He said, I'd rather you be comfortable in eternity than be comfortable now. And so for me, it's been discovering, I think as Royden was sharing, God's ability to turn a terrible situation into a good one. I think if what happens through this time is we all become a lot more focused on our eternal future, our eternal inheritance, that for me would be an amazing way of God working through this time. And that is really what matters, is, when we're a couple of billion years into eternity, this is going to look like a very small speck. So just being a lot more focused on my eternal future, and just finding a lot of comfort, a lot of peace, and a lot of hope in thinking about that.
Well, thank you, Adam. Marcus, how about you? I mean, you work for a missions agency. You must be interacting with missions partners, missionaries all over the world. What are you saying to bring Christian workers hope at this time?
Yeah, that's been a big challenge, because many who felt called to a particular place or a particular people group got stuck either outside of their home country or back in their home country, or they found themselves not able to do their day-to-day ministry. If you are, let's say, leading Bible studies amongst refugees in Greece, and all the refugee centers and refugee camps have been blocked off completely, rightfully so, to prevent the spread of the disease inside the camps, but then your ministry comes to grinding halt. But what I have seen, and this has been so encouraging, the creativity of God's people responding in a moment of crisis. We have seen some amazing training for Muslims online, for example. We have seen people creating these WhatsApp Bible study groups and sharing faith and hope with those who are looking for it, who are even more desperate than they were before. Imagine arriving as a refugee in Europe, hoping for some kind of work, some kind of income, and then the economy tanks and you cannot go to work. And you cannot go back to your home country. You cannot leave the refugee camp you're in. So I think we've seen God's people respond in many generous ways. And I think, Mary, just like what St. Peter's has been able to contribute to in Masi, I think there's creativity around how people respond. And I think the bigger question for me is, have we come to depend on certain things that maybe allowed us in ministry to depend less on God? Have we become dependent on traveling to visit missionaries? Have we become dependent on technology? Have we become dependent on certain things that maybe the Lord is helping us see now? While they were useful, maybe this is increasing our dependence on God and thinking in new ways about what does it mean to bring the gospel to those who have least chance of hearing it. And it may not be going physically. It may be very different. And we've seen some amazing things happening in Iran with online Farsi training resources. And some of the churches that do online service and have done it for years, long before COVID, in closed or difficult countries, are seeing massive spikes in viewership. One couple was doing marriage training seminars for people from a Muslim background. And they used to do it in person, and they would get like 30 people. And when they did it online, they got over 300 people joining in on marriage training seminars. People are sitting at home, or they're sitting in places where they can't move, and they have the time to do these kind of things. So we've seen people being equipped for ministry in a more intentional way than we have seen before. And that, I think, bodes well for God's work. God's work doesn't stop. And I think for me, the encouraging thing in the midst of massive challenges, personally and as a mission organization, we have seen God move in ways that that we did not see before. So I think paying attention to what God is doing and the good that he's doing in all of this, and some of you have hinted at it already, I think that is the exciting bit. So keeping pace with God's heartbeat for his people and for the lost, I think is always encouraging. So that's kind of what's really helped me in keeping going.
Praise God, man. Thank you, Marcus. Let's turn to a few questions now, guys. You'll see, I think Carl's got a question addressed to everyone, so happy for any of you to kind of jump in. Just anyone maybe you picked up in your reading, just any historical parallels, anything you think we can learn from history about our present situation. I don't know who wants to take a stab at that one.
I can take an epidemiological stab at it.
Yeah, go for it.
I think look back, and I think Carl has mentioned some of these to me even as well, but I think look back at times in history where we've had serious disease and death, whether that be the Black Plague, whether that be Spanish flu, whether that be a localized Ebola outbreak like in Liberia, or if it's a war or a critically dangerous situation from natural disasters, and you see how God's people have responded and what that has meant for the gospel. I think that, to me, looking at some of those stories of believers who were responding in crisis at that time can be hugely encouraging for us today.
Good. Hey guys, those watching, now's the time to send in questions. We've got time for feel free to send in. There's a question there for Royden. Royden, what are the implications for the taxpayer with regards to the money SA is borrowing for COVID-19 relief?
It could mean that at some point they have to raise taxes as part of their efforts to balance the budget. They are sensitive to the fact that the taxpayers are pretty fatigued, and the kinds of places where there's perhaps still room, say for instance in VAT, again, don't have a lot of political support because that disproportionately affects the poor. So, so that is one avenue when we borrow money, is to try and recoup those funds via tax revenue in order to service that debt. And but I think there is some understanding that, look, there's not a whole lot of scope to do that. We are our net effective tax rate is pretty high by global standards, so there's not a whole lot of room to move there. But we'll just have to see what Tito and Co decide.
Royden, anything just from you quickly about life in church and how what are some of the positives you've seen from a church point of view?
I think it's taught us that online church is not really an option. Yeah. So the great desire of God's people to be together is overwhelming, and that's really positive. People want to be back together. At the same time, a friend of mine was on a webinar, Sean Storer, some of you may know him, and everyone was saying this. Everyone was lamenting the fact that it's all content and no community from the ministry point of view. We're producing content, but there's no community. And one guy, Daryl Bock, who's a well-known New Testament scholar, and he's had an online ministry for a long, long time. And he said, listen, I understand that, and I understand it's a natural Christian instinct, but while we are pining for the gathered church, let's not miss the opportunity that there is in equipping the scattered church. And I think that's what this is teaching us in one way, is there's so much we can do. There's so much we can put in the hands of our Christians who are kind of at the coalface, if you like, in the workplace. They're interacting with people. They are in various networks, and we're giving them online content that they can then share in their efforts to evangelize. They can forward on a link. they can invite people to various webinars like this. And so I think that's the point he was making. So all this content that we're producing, devotionals, videos, podcasts, it really does equip the scattered church. And we've seen people join some of our life groups from Zimbabwe and from the UK, and so our life groups are organized geographically, except for the person who joins you from the UK. They are now the outlier. So there are those sorts of benefits and fruits that we've seen, and we're learning new things. And I don't actually think we're fully understanding what we're learning and what God is doing in and through us right now. I think there's more that we'll only come to see after the fact.
Guys, we said we'd try and keep this to about an hour. I mean, I see a few more questions rolling in, but I think I thought I'd just give you each. Is anything else anybody on the panel wants to add before we wrap up?
Yeah, I want to add something, if I may, Murray.
Sure, go for it.
You've heard people say never waste a good crisis, and it might be a bit soon to say that with the COVID realities. But as a Christian, I've always believed that all things work together for good for those that know and love God. And I have no doubts that despite the tragedies and the confusion and the anxieties with COVID, that I will benefit as a Christian, and I will grow as a person. And in education, we don't really mind mistakes happening because we use them as part of an opportunity to educate our kids about life. I just want to encourage the parents to use the experiences that they're going through, the uncharted territories, as an opportunity to teach your kids about life. That is an exciting possibility and opportunity at this time.
Gavin, thank you, man. Let me say a huge thank you to everyone on our panel. Thank you to everyone who joined in. Sorry to leave it there. I see a few more questions then, but I think I'll close in prayer. And yeah, we've got a pen next week. Next week Wednesday, actually, we're looking at the question: what will change in church after when in the future? And we'll actually have the St. Peter's staff team actually discussing that. So we will be thinking quite specifically about St. Peter's. What will church look like as things start to open up, as we hopefully start to gather at some point. So that's next Wednesday. And yeah, bear in mind we've recorded this session and it'll be posted on our YouTube page in the next couple of days. But thanks so much, everyone. Let me close in prayer for us. Father God, we thank you so much that you've given us minds that allow us to think and try and predict what might happen, that we can prepare for the future. But Father, we know that it'll always be imperfect. We know that ultimately we need to rely on you. We don't really know one day to the next exactly what will happen. We need to entrust our lives into your hands. We thank you for the reminder this evening that you can work all things, even things that seem so chaotic and so distressing, even things as evil as the death of your son. You can work all things for good. And Father, we thank you for that. We thank you for your providence, your care, your love for us in Jesus. And as we look to the future, let us keep our eyes fixed firmly on him, and let us hope for the future that he has made possible for all of us. We ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen.
Hi there, we are St. Peter's Fishhook, and we hope that you found this audio and video helpful and stimulating. If you did, please could you share it with someone you know who would also be interested in this topic. And if you have any questions, and please feel free to comment or visit our website where you can contact us directly or find our email or WhatsApp details. To find out more about why we're making these videos and what our church is about, check out the video on the right. And if you're interested in learning more about answers Jesus claims to have about the big questions of life, you should definitely check out our life series. Click the video on the left to find out more.